follow up real data, and of course we'd all beat a path to Gerson's door and a Gerson clinic's door if it turned out to work. And why people don't do that, I don't know. This is how you convince science. This is how we move forward. This is how we got to where we are today.
I agreed with Dr. Dina Dell to move forward, and so I drove south to Los Angeles after hearing that Charlotte Gerson was giving a lecture at a health convention in Long Beach. When I entered the convention building, I got the feeling that I was about to meet many people who are dissatisfied with the effectiveness of orthodox medicine, that felt smothered, restricted, and force-fed medical propaganda that simply didn't work. Why else would they be here? Which gave rise to another observation. If orthodox treatments for cancer and chronic disease really worked, I would think nobody would want to come to hear Charlotte Gerson talk in the first place. Take this audience member, for example. There were many like him there.
3 years ago, I discovered I had lymphoma cancer. I had the best chemotherapy that there was, and I thought I was cured. 2 years later, the cancer returned at a higher stage. It was stage 4. I then commenced my second set of chemotherapy, but I realised that the prognosis was poor. During the chemotherapy, I did some research. In fact, I spent 3 months of researching, and I found that the Gerson's therapy was my best chance of escaping this cancer. And I then decided to meet Charlotte Gerson. I'm from Australia. I flew out just for the weekend to meet with Charlotte and hear her talk and to learn more about my therapy. When the cancer returned for the second time, my spleen was so large it was poking out from just below my ribs. After 5 months of Gerson's therapy, the spleen had reduced back to the normal size, and in fact the oncologist said that I was in total remission.
William's story is profound, but I sense that many people would tune out a testimony like this, like someone who claims they've seen a ghost or listened to some infomercial. But what if William's story, like the people I met earlier, were of hundreds, even thousands of cured people?
We had a wonderful story of a little boy, 8 years old, who was of a group of 7 other kids. All of them had Ewing sarcoma. He came to Mexico to the Gerson clinic, pale, very thin, no hair, bald, and quite sick with pain. He was put on the Gerson therapy, sent home, and the mother reported that within 3 months the tumor was gone. Not only that, 2 years later, he was a strapping young fellow with lots of hair. He was growing. He was active in school. More important yet, he recovered while the other 6 children in the group who had received chemotherapy and only chemotherapy were all dead.
If that story was rare, perhaps it would be easier to somehow dismiss, but this is another typical recovery. Charlotte allowed me to stay at her home a little longer and to actually go through the files of 1,500 patients Dr. Gerson was treating and following at the time of his death.
Further, any physician is heartily invited to come to the Mexican hospital and visit and see a patient there or visit with the patients, and with their permission, then they would have access to their medical records.
I remembered what Dr. Dina Dell had said.
What would it take to convince people, and yourself, that the Gerson therapy has merit?
That's a simple question, Steve. What would it take to convince me that the Gerson therapy works? A simple double-blind study, follow-up real data. And of course we'd all beat a path to Gerson's door and a Gerson clinic's door if it turned out to work.
And so I joined Charlotte at the Mexican clinic, witnessed the treatments, met the patients. This man had cancer of the mouth. She had cervical cancer. He had prostate cancer. She had an ascites tumor. The Gerson clinic is unusual in that the atmosphere there seems more like a royal hotel. I met others that were previous patients. This lady had pancreas cancer and became friends with actor Michael Landon when he was diagnosed with it. She recounted how after he went on network television stating that he was doing the Gerson therapy, his doctors discouraged him from continuing it, whereupon he died. This woman had ovarian cancer. With this lady, it was cervical cancer. and this gal had liver disease. I then met with Dr. Wallace Sampson, clinical professor emeritus at Stanford University, and editor of the Scientific Review of Alternative Medicine. Today he took me for a walk instead of his dog.
Well, the reason we don't like these therapies is, first of all, to give people false hope. And they're rip-offs. You know, there's someone making a big profit off of this kind of activity. And that's just morally wrong. Morally wrong, ethically wrong. It's not right from any aspect at all.
Well, has the Gerson therapy ever cured a cancer patient?
Oh, of course not. They won't even release their records. They published one paper on something called melanoma, skin cancer, but they selected the cases they reported. They didn't report everything that happened. They don't keep that kind of a record on all patients, so they have nothing to show us. And yet they keep on making the same claims that they made in the 1920s when Dr. Gerson first came over here from Germany, 1930s. But he was doing this for tuberculosis and other diseases also.
What would it take for you to be convinced or even persuaded a slight bit that this therapy has credibility?
Well, first of all, they have to show some reason why it should work. We know how cancers behave, and we know the kinds of things that cause cancer. So they have to come up with some kind of a believable theory of why their diet should work. But second of all, they'd have to convince us that everything we know about it in the past 50 years is wrong, and they're right. Now, how are they going to come up with material like that? That's impossible. They don't have it. So we're left with nothing with that outfit.
What do they charge?
I've heard as much as $15,000 up front for a week for the first few days, and they'll charge as much until you go broke, and then they'll send you home.
Have you ever met any of their patients that claim that they're recovered?
No, never met one. Mostly they die. Either that or they don't have cancer in the first place, or they have a very low-grade cancer and they would have lived no matter what they did.
I knew Dr. Sampson had exaggerated the cost at the clinic by a factor of 5. So now what could I believe?
So each cancer is going to have to have its characteristics determined, individually probably, and a tailored treatment developed by the oncologists. Now, we're talking real medicine here. We're not talking alternative medicine. We're talking real medicine. This is how it's going to be. Alternative medicine, there really is no such thing. Few people know this, but the word alternative and the whole concept of alternative medicine is only 20 or 30 years old. Someone invented it. They invented it as a marketing slogan. There is no such thing as alternative medicine. It's just a series of unproven, disproven, and implausible kinds of proposals made for commercial purposes. They're selling you a bill of goods.
A few other questions came to mind.
Your son works for the American Cancer Society. What does he think of therapy such as the Gerson therapy?
Well, he knows the same things that we know, that I know. The American Cancer Society used to be very active in exposing these kinds of things, but more recently they've backed off because of the public relations aspect. There's so many political powerhouses and rich people who are in back of these implausible proposals that in order to keep their contributions coming, they can't be too opposed to some of these things.
Like the Gerson therapy?
Yeah, well, they're opposed to it, but they don't put nearly the amount of publicity into their opposition that they used to.
What is the answer to cancer? In the future, what do you think it'll be?
Well, it'll be a combination of finding out what the molecular basis is. In other words, there are certain molecules that are made by the body that stimulate growth, and certain other genes that code for the behavior of cells. And we'll figure that out, and then we'll combat them with drugs.
Dr. Gerson treated the sick human organism in its totality. He was inducted into the Orthomolecular Hall of Fame just last year, almost 50 years after his death. Considering that both Dr. Dean Adele and Dr. Wallace Sampson stated that no one has ever been cured of anything on the Gerson therapy, I visited the Gerson Institute and found over 100 more patients on file. I selected 2 at random and requested interviews.
The day that my oncologist gave me 3 to 6 months to live, I had to go home and tell my children. That was the first thing on my mind, to tell them. And I was devastated. My husband had to practically carry me out of the office. I went home and I told them. I had 2 teenagers there, and my daughter was